question is about stage directions. The stage directions are fairly major in Accidental Death for an Anarchist. The question is asking what's the impression it gives us of the centres of power, and how is symbolism used? What did you make of these two questions? First of all, what impression it gives us of the centres of power. You know, the police station in Milan is one of those centres of power. What's the impression that you get from it by looking at this passage? What do we think of this place, Tina?
I think we describe it as very lifeless, but at the same time it's disorganized because of the desk littered with papers. And also, it actually says the room is drab and bureaucratic, and I think the objects that he names, a chair, a bench, filing cabinet, makes it seem very standard.
Also seems lifeless. Anything you put into this that I haven't thought about, I'm going to add with my magical pink pen. You're completely right. You know, that it is both. I think it's an undesirable combination of lifelessness and disorganized. You know, those two things seem to be quite a cocktail of negative traits. You know, usually we associate disorganized with perhaps wild people who are fun and full of life, but here it's a kind of awful mixture of both. It's litters with papers and files, and the maniac obviously takes advantage of this throughout the rest of this scene by throwing the files out the window and doing all kinds of scurrilous, rebellious things. But it does demonstrate this kind of casual lack of concern that the place seems to display, and that it's also extremely drab and bureaucratic. I'll tell you these things at this beginning point in the play, because actually the symbolism in this is not super obvious, because it's just ordinary objects carry quite strong symbolic connotations in this play, and the window functions as a major symbol throughout the play of the point through which truth is accessed. You know, it obviously suggests the act of the murder of the anarchist itself, because he's pushed out of the window, but the window is the sort of the conduit, this sort of tunnel through which truth is sort of funneled into the reality of the play and actually pushed out of the reality of the play. So if you think of the window as a symbol for where truth comes in and out of the text, it will help you to see the purpose of what the maniac's doing later on in the scene, when he keeps hopping up on the windowsill and hopping down from the windowsill and hopping back up on the windowsill and throwing things out of the window. You know, it's all about truth every time the window is mentioned.
Can also the whole setting be a symbol of Italy, like maybe the chaos?
I think probably, but it's something I didn't necessarily want to write down because it sounds quite xenophobic, you know, as an Englishman go, yeah, this is just Italy for you, this is what it sounds like. But when I've been to police stations in Italy, which is only once, because I lost my wallet, that on its own is something quite remarkable to me, that when you lose your wallet, you have to go to the police station. You know, in England, you just ring up your bank and say, can I have another bank card? And I'll send it to you. Not so in Italy. Yeah, you need documents to prove that you've had it lost, and then you need to take the documents to the bank before they'll get you a new card. So it actually took me something like, you just ring the bank up and say, can I have another card? And then 2 days later, one arrives on your door, and that's it. No one needs documents for anything. There's documents for everything. There's a file or a piece of paperwork for basically everything. And I've got this, I remember carrying out this experience, and it reminded me so much of these opening stage directions, where I went into the police station, and obviously being completely illiterate in Italian, that made it also a bit more challenging. But I went there the first time, and I needed something to get a form from the police. I can't remember what it was. That was it. I had to ring the blocking thing on the phone to block my card, and then I had to give them a code before they would give me a form, and then I'd get the form and I'd take the form to the bank, and then the bank would order me a card, and then I have to go back to the bank, which is only open when you're at work, so you have to take time off work to go get a new bank card. This was a wonderful sort of odyssey. It was a real insight into Italy, my first year here. And when I went to the police station, first of all, they turned me away because I didn't have this code, this blockato or something or other. I don't know what it was called. And then I waited for about an hour outside this man's office. And I presumed that there was someone in there and that there was a queue, but of course there wasn't. He was just in there watching TV. He had this gigantic kind of office, this huge TV like the size of my bulletin board at the back. And he was smoking a cigarette and it was going out the window. And he had just a lot of stamps. He had like a whole, almost like a sort of machine gun belt of bullets, but full of rubber stamps. And he was like rubber stamping all these things. And then that was the thing I had to take to the bank to get my new card. And then take a day off work. And I was like, this is unreal. This is amazing. Like this, I mean, that stuff is where you can sort of see why economically Italy is not as efficient as some other countries. You know, you look at that and you think, that's just to get me a thing that I can then use to spend my money. It took 3 months. So whilst that's happening, I'm not actually able to properly spend my cash. You know, and if that's happening on thousands of different levels, it's no wonder that people talk about it in terms of being stagnant and starchy and bureaucratic. And that's absolutely the impression that you get from these opening stage directions, is of this sort of bureaucracy that it's sort of dysfunctional in its nature. There's something dysfunctional about the bureaucratic nature of the police station. The final little part of the directions, a constable who takes the inspector's coat and hat to the coat stand, is a way of emphasising the constable's kind of deference to the inspector. It makes it very clear that there's a sort of hierarchy that they clearly and rigidly observe. The second question, how does Bettozzo's opening lines create a sense of uncertainty and tension around the central focus of the play, which is the extent to which the behaviour of the police can be understood as criminal? I mean, there's lots of phrases within this passage that make us uneasy about the role of the police here. You know, he says, "This is my office on the first floor of our notorious headquarters here in Milan." You know, that phrase itself already brings us a sense of discomfort. What is it about the fact that he calls it notorious that is kind of problematic?
Because someone jumped off the...
Jumped, that's exactly what the maniacs did. They jumped, did they? If you say that the police headquarters are notorious, notoriety is not usually, no. Absolutely, it's famous for having bad things go wrong here. And even the police are openly declaring this fact, our notorious headquarters. Notorious following a sordid little incident a few weeks ago. Now that also is deeply ambiguous. Because from this man's perspective, what is it about it that Bettozzo thinks is sordid? In his sort of simple brain, he calls it sordid. For what reason? What's sordid about it? Why is it kind of morally dodgy? Not sure. And think about it, the way he talks about, for example, Dario Fo over the page. He says, "I ought to warn you, the author of this sick little play has the traditional irrational hatred of the police common to all narrow-minded left-wingers." That's why it's sordid, because it's bringing the reputation of the police into disrepute. You know, it's making them sound questionable and clandestine. You know, and that's what's sordid about it. It's not actually what we're reading, you or hearing in that line is, well, it's sordid because what they've actually done is collaborate with neo-fascists and murder someone. You know, that's what's sordid, not that it's bringing the police into disrepute. So there's a kind of ambiguity about the sordid little incident, I think, that's important here. When he further down, though, says, "Although my colleagues claimed quite reasonably that the incident was suicide," there's something about the grammar of this sentence that is important to untangle. If you think about subordination as a grammatical concept, you know, while something, comma, this thing is the main clause that follows a subordinate clause is usually where you emphasize the thing that is most important. In this sentence, he says, "Although my colleagues claimed quite reasonably the incident was suicide, the official verdict of the inquiry was that the death of the anarchist was accidental." The bit that he puts in the subordinate clause is their defense. My colleagues claimed quite reasonably the incident was suicide. So the bit that goes in the least important part of the sentence is their version of events. So in that subordinate clause, that lesser part of the sentence, there's a sort of implicit admission that they know their story is weak. You know, if you say, although I'm terrible at dancing, I value my ability to express myself verbally. It's quite clear from that sentence that the second part of it is the bit that I have faith in and trust, and the first part is the bit that sounds a bit shifty. That's exactly what this sentence does. Although my colleagues claimed quite reasonably the incident was suicide, dodgy, the official verdict of the inquiry is that the death of the anarchist was accidental, in speech marks. So there's, within the grammar of that sentence, I think an implicit admission of the weakness of their story. Why does it matter that accidental is the word that's used and that it's in speech marks? How do you have an accidental death?
It's emphasizing it's not accidental at all.
The speech marks most definitely call into question the validity of the term. If you do that to anything, it immediately distances you from agreeing with the claim. What do you make of an accidental death? No one planned it. No one meant it. No one caused it. In terms of its status, though, what it definitely does is it affects whether we call it suicide. Why? If it's accidental, it can't really be suicide. Because suicide implies intentionality. And so this category, accidental, takes it away from suicide, which is the police's version of events. How does someone fall out of a window if they're not meaning to do it? By accident. How do you accidentally fall out of a window?
So he's saying that the suicide was accidental.
He's saying here that their version of the events is suicide, and that the official verdict has disagreed with their version of events. It hasn't said that they murdered him, but it has said that it wasn't suicide. Because if it's accidental, it can't be suicide. Because suicide is intentional. So even though this term doesn't confer blame on the police exactly, it does call into question their version of events, which is the whole impetus for the play. The whole impetus for the play is to probe that version of events. Even the police officer says, a bit ambiguous, you see. They don't really know what that means, accidental death. You know, its legal status, it's not, it's not clear who caused it according to this, and it's that sense of ambiguity that immediately corrodes our sense of trust in him as an individual. That's what the whole purpose of these opening lines are to do. The last little part here. So there's been public outrage, accusations, demonstrations, and so on flying around this building for weeks. Not the best atmosphere in which a decent 9-to-5 plainclothes policeman like myself can do an honest, inconspicuous day's work. Now, there's something wonderfully ironic about this when this is how he introduces himself. I'm Inspector Francesco Giovanni Battista Giacomo Tosso of the Security Police. What jars, what makes you feel that there's something ironic about the way he introduces himself and then this very forced description of himself at the bottom? Ordinary plainclothes 9-to-5 policeman is trying to drum up an interpretation of him. It's trying to emphasize some qualities of his status. This way of introducing himself is a complete reverse. Why?
Because at the beginning, when he's introducing himself, he's creating kind of like an air of power and hierarchy, while later on when he says a 9-to-5 plainclothes policeman, it's as if he's like a normal person. It's as if he's ordinary, like there's nothing amiss.
Absolutely. And so whilst that fact on its own isn't vitally important, the fact that he wants to be superior and ordinary simultaneously all the time, what is important is the fact that it makes his verdict and his version of events unreliable. We look at it and think, well, hang on, a minute ago he was kind of blowing smoke up his own ass. And now here he is telling us that he's an everyday working Joe. Clearly he's not reliable. Clearly what he says is slippery in some way. The truth is unstable in his mouth. And it doesn't really matter what it's about here. It's the way that it corrodes our sense of his reliability that is all important in the sort of farcical nature of his opening entrance into the play.
But also he's talking about that which is his job to solve, and he's saying that
Absolutely. Here, in that last one, it's public outrage, accusations, demonstrations, so on, flying around this building for weeks. Not the best atmosphere in which a decent 9-to-5 policeman can do an honest day's work. He describes this as a sort of inconvenience. This is just a sort of minor inconvenience that's getting in the way of his job. But that is his job, to try and deal with justice and criminal justice. That's exactly what he's tasked with providing. But the way he describes the atmosphere that's been created, as Drusa said, it's kind of given us this sense of it being a massive inconvenience to it. You know, that there is this sense of outrage about the incident itself. I want to move on to this third question, because this requires a bit of background knowledge to talk about this. How the stage directions introduce the maniac connect the Brechtian theatrical ideas regarding meta-theatre and alienation. Anyone remember what was said about what this is? Can you remember the weird German word? Brechtian theatrical ideas. Can't remember the strange Germanic word that I used for this. Yeah, it's close. The Verfremdungseffekt. I just love saying it. It's just so much fun. The alienation effects that Brecht was so famous for producing, that distance you from the play itself and highlight that sense of theatricality overtly. You know, it's the equivalent in prose where you have a narrator that keeps reminding you that he's a narrator, you know, like you have in How to Tell a True War Story. In theatre, it's anything that reminds you that you're watching a theatrical spectacle on purpose. So it's deliberately showing you that you're watching a play rather than posing as reality itself. This is vital to the maniac's opening costume, appearance, and props. He says he looks like the cliche idea of a disciple of Freud. Why does this matter, that we see him as a cliched performance of a disciple of Freud? Why isn't it, you know, implied to us that he looks a bit like someone who may be a psychiatrist? What does it say about the police that he is a cliched portrayal of Freud and they still sort of fall for his performance? Which is a kind of
undermines their intelligence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is the whole point of this. His performance is deliberately ludicrous. You know, he is dramatic, but in a way that he so deliberately draws attention to the dramatic nature of his performance that when they then believe him, it makes them look stupid for believing in it. You know, if someone is deliberately useless and then someone else then believes that it's reality, it massively undermines the people who are doing the believing, the police. So this meta-theatre that you see here a lot of the time is deliberately meant to expose the limited nature of the police's understanding and intelligence. He looks like the cliched idea of a disciple of Freud, and yet they end up kind of taking him seriously as a sort of false psychiatrist. His directions here, where he says he has a goatee beard, a shabby suit on Mac, and he sits calmly. He carries about 4 plastic carrier bags stuffed with God knows what. Now, this is a really important part of his characterization, and actually one of the things that lots of students, when they wrote about this text last year, chose to write about were the way that props are used and Brechtian theatrical conventions. In his bag is his own props. He's carrying his own theatrical props with him, and that's deliberately meta-theatrical. He's exposing to the audience that he's a performance and that there is no real authentic maniac. He's saying to them, well, here's all the things I'm going to use to pretend in a minute to be someone different. I'm going to pretend to be a judge in a little while. Here's my silly glasses with no lenses in them. So his props emphasizes his theatricality, so that when he's later, his theatricality, the performative nature of his role, and it shows the kind of the hollowness of the authority positions that he ends up mimicking. You know, he's a judge, he's a psychiatrist. If you can just carry a kind of bag of rubbish props around and have people believe that you're those things, what is the credibility of those roles in the first place? What are they if some maniac can just act them out and everyone believes that that's what you are? You know, that is quite sort of subversive. It's a subversive theatrical gesture because it deliberately undermines the status of the identities that he performs. You know, he pretends to be a judge, and they all sort of start off thinking, oh, he's ridiculous, but then actually afterwards they're like, oh, kind of seems convincing. That exposes their own lack of intelligence, but it also exposes the performative nature of identity itself. The identity itself is nothing more than a farcical charade. And this is what meta-theatre is about in this play a lot of the time, is exposing the theatrical nature of reality, rather than making reality theatrical. It already is. That's what he articulates in these lines here. There's a lot in the stage directions and his costume choices that seem kind of throwaway, unimportant comic details, but actually are central to what's sophisticated about the play. The next lines, how does Bertozzo break the fourth wall? Now, the fourth wall is the thing that reminds you that you're watching. Is the thing that, if you expose the fourth wall, it's the imaginary kind of assumed understanding between actors and audience that what you're watching is reality. If you break the fourth wall, you remind the audience that you're not watching reality, you're watching a theatrical performance. So a fourth wall violation in theatre is anything that reminds you you're watching a play. Exactly. He then says, why does Foe give the policeman this quality of sort of theatrical self-awareness? I ought to warn you that the author of this sick little play, Dario Fo, has the traditional irrational hatred of the police common to all narrow-minded left-wingers. And so I shall, no doubt, be the unwilling butt of endless anti-authoritarian jibes. Why does he choose to do it with the police, do you think? Why does he choose to give the police this quality? It's quite an abstract concept, why he would choose to put this type of line in the mouth of an authority figure.
So he's basically saying that he's not a real, like, it's undermining his position and authority because he's basically saying admitting that he's just a character.
Yeah, if you draw attention to the theatricality of the thing that grants you existence, his role in the play, it's a way of underlining the theatrical nature of what you do. It's a way of drawing attention and calling into question the status of who you are. So whilst it seems to offer this kind of plausible, basically prejudice of authority figures against the left wing politically, it does also call into question the authority and the authenticity of his position. He seems as much a sort of self-conscious construction as the rest of the characters in the text. So these fourth wall violations are often about reminding ourselves that reality is as much theatre as theatre itself a lot of the time, and that theatre sometimes is more reality than reality. You know, if you think about the Trump election, you know, that has the element of sort of farcical theatre about it. Lots of the things that have gone on since, you know, is turning the global politics and diplomacy into a sort of weird theatrical performance. That sort of overall point about the way that political life can be theatrical, I think this play is one of the first to really get to the core of what that means, you know, by deliberately exposing its sort of ridiculous nature. The play is making this very serious point that our reality is as ridiculous as this farce. And those moments of meta-theatre are there to remind us that the boundaries between theatre and reality are not very clear, and they're quite porous. You know, reality seeps into theatre, theatre seeps into reality quite fluidly in this play. After these lines, though, he follows it with what we'd call lazzi, that comes from Commedia dell'arte, the kind of slapstick moments of stupidity. Why immediately follow that line with the constable encountering a mousetrap hidden in the filing cabinet? What's the point of having that sort of serious attack on the playwright and then a moment of ridiculous slapstick? It takes us from seriousness to comic ridicule within the space of a line. Why do that?
Because what we talked about was with trying to stop catharsis, because if you have that kind of release of a lot of the emotions, then you can't then then you don't get angry about it. So if after this kind of serious, I don't know, segment,
Yeah.
and you have another event that kind of cuts it short, then you don't have time to kind of reach the peak of emotional, I don't know, power.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. You know, this. If you think about the likely audience of this play and how they would react to a line like this, you know, when Foe tells you it's mainly progressive students, members of protest movements and political organisations on the left wing, they're going to get angry about people saying this. But then, boom, it's interrupted. Sorry, there's a slapstick moment for you to just puncture that sort of bubble of comic, of anger that he just constantly provokes and then just stops, provokes and stops, provokes and stops. So that the experience of watching this is this gradual sort of simmering sense of anger that doesn't go anywhere. It remains with you the whole time. It also undermines the previous gravity of what he's saying in these lines. You know, there's a sort of articulate critique here of Foe that is completely undermined by this sudden moment of ridiculous kind of comic slapstick behaviour that's farcical. The fifth question says, how does the exchange between Bertozzo and the maniac reveal the way in which identity is socially produced and subject to the influences of power? How might the maniac's supposed insanity constitute a form of resistance? In these lines, what is it about identity that's being exposed through what the maniac says when he says things like 11 arrests altogether, but I'd like to point out I've never actually been convicted, Inspector. Absolutely. He has a clearer grasp of reality than Bertozzo. But if he's been arrested 11 times for impersonation and things to do with pretending that he's someone he's not, that is, by implication, criticising the police. You know, why is that criticising the police if it's taken them 11 times to arrest him and he keeps, you know, repeat offending? Absolutely. The police have continually failed to do their job. You know, if he's had 11 arrests and they're all based on fraud or pretending to be someone they're not, just the existence of the 11 arrests is an implied critique of the police because it proves that they can't do anything about it. So he inadvertently exposes their own sort of inadequacy when he says, I've never actually been convicted. You've never actually managed to catch me for anything. You know, that's what he deliberately is exposing in those lines. And then Bertozzo says, I don't know how the hell you've been getting away with it. And, you know, he gives away his own stupidity in the accusation. I don't know how you've been getting away with it. Well, that's not saying a great deal for his prowess as the person enacting criminal justice. And then the maniac's response is mouth-watering, isn't it? A nice, clean record like mine just begging to be defiled. Why does he say this to Bertozzo? What is it that he's trying to draw out of him by using these lines? He's trying to provoke him and tempt him into something. Mouth-watering, the idea that the maniac actually has a clean record that hasn't been accused of anything. Why is that provoking Bertozzo? What's he trying to get him to do?
It's kind of like tempting Bertozzo to go against the law and do something outside of the police order.
Absolutely.
By kind of circumventing the way that things should be to force the maniac into jail. Absolutely.
He here is deliberately kind of tempting him to do something clandestine, something secret and immoral and unlawful. He also exposes the police's sort of fetishized approach to punishment, their masochism, their desire to inflict punishment, that his clean record is mouth-watering, that it's so tempting, it's almost sort of sexual in nature, and he deliberately uses these lines to make it sound like sexual temptation. You're waiting to defile me. You know, he's making it sound like some sort of weird sexual sadomasochism. The word defiled, though, has a different meaning when you think about the actions that take place in the rest of this scene. What kind of defiling does the maniac engage in later on in the scene?
Throwing files.
Absolutely. Launching the files out of the window. So he quite literally defiles the police station. And there's a deliberate play on words being used in that line here, where he's talking about his own cleanliness as a criminal, waiting to be defiled. But then if we think about what that means, it means to in some way break down what is clear and moral and true and make it messy. Well,
referring to the theater, but no,
theatricality,
Yes.
that one. What about it?
Because if he's trying to all the boundaries between theater and reality are always still he's emphasizing while they're unclear.
Absolutely. If he talks here about something that he later on goes to prove as part of his theatrical farce, and actually at this point makes it sound like it's part of the reality of his punishment, both of them seem kind of farcical and undermined by that similarity. But the defiling means to corrupt something. But when he defiles the police station, he frees it from a type of corruption. There's a sort of oppositional interpretation of that word involved in what they think of defiling him and what he thinks defiling the police station is. He's lobbing the files out of the window. He's sort of freeing it from corruption. There's a deliberate sort of ambiguity about the terms there. The sixth question: how do the maniac's comments at the opening of page 3 reflect on the political purpose of the play's interweaving of factual reality and farcical theatricality? Well, if you look at his lines, he says, committed 16 times, same thing every time. Histrionic mania, from the Latin histrionis, to act the part of. My hobby, you see, the theatre, and my theatre is the theatre of reality. So my fellow artistes must be real people, unaware that they're acting in my productions, which is handy, as you see. I've got no cash to pay them. This is sort of one of the most complex bits in the opening here. If you think about the fact that he is being deliberately presented and self-presents as ludicrous, he turns up the cliched idea of a disciple of Freud. He's got glasses that don't have any glass in them. In this previous line, he hands them this crumpled piece of paper, which is supposed to be his health record. He's deliberately performing the role of someone ludicrous. But he merges with reality, which by implication satirically presents reality. If something ludicrous joins seamlessly with reality, then by implication reality is as ludicrous as the thing that it joins with. Does that make sense? No.
Yeah.
If you think of him being something mad, easily fitting into something that's supposedly not mad, the fact that something mad easily fits into something not mad makes what's not mad, mad. And that's what he seems to be saying about reality.
Fitting with reality makes reality mad.
Exactly. If he fits with reality, even after he's deliberately exposed his own theatrical nature, his complete unreliability, it forces the audience to question what actually is reality. The socially produced lies of reality are what this play is deliberately attacking. But the maniac does it by being part of the problem, being part of the thing that the play critiques and exposing it for all of its flaws.
Also, above all, he is literally telling the police exactly what he does. And they later on fall for it too.
Absolutely.
So if you know kind of the trick that he's going to pull, and you still fall for the trick, that undermines your intelligence even more.
Absolutely. And then when he says things like this, I've never swindled anyone. Well, he swindles them. Because he tells them exactly what he's up to, and they still fall for it later on. So that, again, exposes their own stupidity. The fact that he deliberately exposes his own performative nature, and that they still fall for his performances. It completely destabilizes what we then see as reality, and what authority figures see as reality. In the second half of the exchange, how does the maniac ironically expose the sham of political power? One of the lines in this, he talks about the fee that he charges as a pretend psychiatrist. And you can see the constable's laziness, because his first thought is, I could retire on that. He mentions 200,000 lira. And the constable's first thought is how to not do any work. That's his first thought that gets exposed here. And then the maniac says, it's a reasonable fee for a man with my qualifications. Well, we've just heard him tell us that he's constantly pretending to be different things that are unreliable. So the fact that he then suddenly resorts back to pretending that his role is real shows us that when people use this type of language, we can't trust it always. You know, it sounds legitimate in his mouth. It's a reasonable fee for a man with my qualifications. It's exactly the kind of thing you would expect to reasonably hear a well-qualified psychiatrist say. But it's in the mouth of someone who has already explained that he is just performing roles. And so what we then hear is convincing lies in the mouth of an actor, which destabilizes our sense of if they're convincing or not. If we know that this is in the mouth of a performative idiot, and it's the same words that would be uttered by someone really in the role, we lose our faith in those performances of authority. It's supposed to expose the kind of hollowness of the performance of authority, which he does with extreme kind of comic energy in these lines. 20 years of intensive training in 16 different loony bins. And you think of the irony of this. His training is being mad. So the training for being a psychiatrist is actually to have the thing that you're supposed to be curing the people of. It would be like training to be a police officer by committing 16 different types of crime. You know, the thing that the psychiatrist is there to fix is the thing that he's doing to train to be a psychiatrist. There's an enormous layer of irony to that as well. That you're being the problem that the job is designed to solve, and that is part of what gives you the authority in the role. Being the problem that you're designed to solve. Obviously, the implied link here is with the police. The police are being the criminals that they're supposed to be there to persecute. If this is what counts as training, then the police are well trained because they've been criminals in the killing of this man. It's under some of the best shrinks in the biz. Unlike your run-of-the-mill man, I immersed myself in my studies, slept with them as well as when the beds ran out. So he talks here quite literally about being the problem that psychiatry is designed to solve. And that's what constitutes training in this ironic presentation of what constitutes authority. Being the things that the authority figures are designed to somehow remedy or fix. You know, it'd be like me saying, yeah, I trained to be a teacher. I just pretended to be an idiot who didn't understand anything for 20 years. And that was the best training I could do. You know, teachers are there to stop people from not understanding stuff. If the training to do that is not understanding stuff, it exposes the premise of the role. So here, the authority position of being a psychiatrist is exposed as a performative sham. If you can train to be it and have people believe that you're one, if you just are nuts for 16 years, and people use that as a sign of authority. And then Bertozzo agrees. Superb fee, okay. So because the fee is high, Bertozzo thinks, okay, that's legitimate. And he says the fee is an indispensable part of the treatment. If I didn't relieve these twits of the odd 200,000, I'd lose all credibility. So if you think of this, it's purely based on a sign of quality rather than quality itself. His authority is based on empty performance. It's based on the signs of authority. It's an empty signifier, the fee. It's not quality psychiatry. It's no guarantee of it. But it's simply a sign of that authority. You know, it could function like having a PhD and being a teacher. You know, it doesn't make you a good teacher if you've got a PhD. You know, it functions as a sign that you may be. But there's absolutely no correlation between having academic qualifications and being an effective teacher. You know, there's some, but not that extreme. So here, this massive fee shows us that these roles, these authority positions, are based purely on performance. And so we then think, well, can we trust any of these people in authority if all of them seem to be part of this performative sham? You know, who is trustworthy in their position of power? And the police are the main ones that all of this satire is kind of leveled at. So it's not as, I've probably slightly ruined it for you, that little momentary bliss where you think, this is actually just funny, this is nice, this is not too complicated, I get it. It's actually quite, it bends your brain quite badly. Thinking about the way that the comedy in this has a a serious kind of political conception. If we take a look further on these newer questions, they kind of range across the scene a little bit more. So, question 4 and 5 asks us how the maniac's playful reactions to police interrogation reflect on the unstable nature of language and its potential for manipulation by those in power. Think about how the maniac manages to farcically adopt the position of power in the exchange without actually answering the question. So we're looking at these passages across 4 and 5. And he begins with this visiting card, but also reads, Professor Antonio Rabbia, psychiatrist, formerly lecturer at the University of Padua. Are you Antonio Rabbia? Not exactly. What does that mean? I am a professor. So, just in terms of this opening exchange, exactly. So he's exposing, first of all, the key thing to bear in mind is that in this line functions as a sort of a paradigm for an authority figure. Professor Antonio Rabbia, psychiatrist. He has the sound of someone important and authority figure in that field. He says, I am a professor, which obviously evades answering this question, are you him? He says, not exactly, but I am a professor. So the only thing that is stable in his declaration has already been exposed as a sham. But the fact that he sort of half gives the police what they want has a dynamic to it where it manages to allow him to evade answering their questions. So he says, well, no, not exactly, but I am a professor. That's the only thing that he's happy to say, but it's already been exposed as a sham. But it prevents them from focusing on their question, are you him or not? Because if you're not, you've committed fraud. But they lose sight of that in his evasive response. And then he says, you are yes, of design, decoration, and freehand drawing at the College of the Sacred Redeemer. I take evening classes. This is going to sound awfully snobby of me, but this is meant to sound like a kind of low rent academic institution. You know, here I'm a professor of design, decoration, and freehand drawing at the College of the Sacred Redeemer. They all sound fictional. All of the parts of this academic title sound like lies. And then the fact that he takes evening classes can mean that he's actually there to learn how to do drawing, not to be an academic professor. If you're taking evening classes, you're probably not a world authority on whatever topic it is that you're taking evening classes for. So there's this complete sense of disconnection and a blatant admission of his performative, fraudulent nature. But it distracts them from asking him, are you Antonio Rabbia, and can we convict you of fraud because you said that you are? So by performing this ludicrous second role, he's given them something else to focus on, and they've lost track of the thing that they're there to try and punish him for. It says here psychiatrist, and then he then drags them in some completely different direction. So think here about what this is telling us about language, this exchange here. Where he says, Professor Antonio Rabbia, comma, capital P, psychiatrist, full stop. I take it you are familiar with the basic rules of syntax and punctuation. Where's the fraud? How do you think he's operating here as a distraction tactic? How does this work as a distraction tactic? What are they trying to penalise him for, and what has he managed to get them to focus on? They're trying to penalise him for what? Fraud. What's he done here?
I don't get it. How does the punctuation make it not fraud?
His argument is that because if you listen to what he says, it says, comma, capital P, psychiatrist. He's implying that because there's a comma between Professor Antonio Rabbia and psychiatrist, that the two are not one single grammatical construction, and that he can be Professor Antonio Rabbia, or he can be a psychiatrist, but the two of them together are not one construction, so he can't be... Exactly. But this is precisely what he ends up doing. He ends up getting them to quibbling with a non-thing. And posing as a linguistic authority whilst doing it. Where's the fraud? And all their response is definitely a crackpot, sir. Formerly lecturer at the University of Padua. True or false? After the formally, what? Another comma. Can't you even read? So he's constantly attacking them with fresh accusations. The A exposes their own insecurity with grammar and punctuation and formality. But more importantly, is a distraction tactic. It's a way of saying to them, well, look at this, you're not reading properly. And so they forget in all of this, they're supposed to be there to penalize him for fraud. But what it also suggests to us is the danger of linguistic manipulation, how language can be manipulated to distract and to gain clandestine kind of political outcomes. You can manipulate words to have an effect on political reality. And then a maniac says, another comma, can't you even read? And Bertozzo says, I hadn't noticed it. So he falls for his distraction tactics. He ends up shifting the conversation so that it's about punctuation, not fraud. And that's all of the skill of his role. This is where he has this kind of Arlecchino role as a trickster from Commedia dell'arte. He's constantly trying to distract people by shape-shifting and using linguistic sort of linguistic dynamism to move people around from the things that they're trying to focus on. His whole presence is like a kind of destabilizing influence on everything that goes on around him. It's really difficult to think straight when you constantly have someone changing the focus and making you look over here and then look over here and then now I'm this thing and now I'm this other thing. This shape-shifting protean quality to his identity is a way of stopping them from actually just holding fire with, you've committed fraud, we're going to punish you for it. They lose track of what they're doing because he drives them so crazy. And so, again, all of this dynamism that he has is a way of exposing the simplicity and lack of intelligence of the police. So, the next one that says, how does the maniac's protean identity reveal itself? In the second half of page 5. So in these lines he says, there's nothing to someone with your rudimentary education, evidently. Look, a minute, the punctuation changes the whole emphasis of the sentence. He goes through this grammatical explanation here. He adopts this sort of another authority position here, as if he is the professor of linguistics, without any logical basis for the adoption of that authority position. Look, a minute, the punctuation changes the whole emphasis of the sentence. After the comma, the reader, your good self, takes a short mental breath, thus changing the intentionality. You see? So the sentence should read, Professor Antonio Rabbia, comma, capital P, psychiatrist, full stop. Formerly, comma, lecturer at the University of Padua. You see? Read correctly, only an arsehole would swallow it. All he's done is just read the sentence and say where the punctuation is. He hasn't explained how it changes how you read the lines. And so all Bertozzo gets distracted by is the fact that he calls him an arsehole at the end of the lines, and that's all he focuses on. No, your grammar is a bit retarded, that's all. I could have given you a refresher course. Cut rate, naturally. Haven't done too well out of this year's spending cuts, have you, boys? Let's begin by repeating all subjective and objective in Italian pronouns beginning thus. Io sono, tu sei, loro sono, and launches off into Italian at the constable. Now, if you think of this, within the space of 2 pages, he's pretended to be a linguistic expert, a psychiatrist, and his role just keeps shape-shifting. And every time he changes shape, they lose track of what they're supposed to be penalizing him for. So every time he adopts a new identity, now professor of linguistics at God knows where, he's been professor of freehand drawing and, what does he call it? Decoration design and freehand drawing at the College of the Sacred Redeemer. Now he's lecturing on the intricacies of punctuation and syntax. Every time he changes, they don't quite know what to pin him down for. They don't really know exactly what his crime is, because he keeps committing fresh ones. And so they've got some new crime to focus on. Every time there's a new one, they lose track of the previous one. And here he is lecturing them about Italian grammar. And then later on, mais oui, that's French. So he's, again, playing with the idea of his own linguistic expertise. At one minute, he's posing as a linguistic authority and then utilizing puns to make fun of language. So simultaneously posing as an authority figure and mocking it without them being able to track the changes between those things. And then Bertozzo finally loses his patience. May we get on with this fucking statement? He loses his temper, and then the maniac's response is to what? Shapeshift again. Now he's the secretary who's responsible for typing up the statement. So he was a linguistic expert, he's been a judge, he's been professor of freehand drawing, now he's a qualified secretary, 45 words a minute. So actually, if you want to type the statement, I'm there for you. I'll type it for you. But of course, the statement is about what he is saying. So you can't type it and say it at the same time. This shape-shifting is a constant distraction tactic that is meant to deliberately expose the police's lack of ability, but also to show us the kind of protean nature of identity itself. That all of our authority positions are based on performativity. We are performing roles all the time. And there's a truth in this. There is a theatrical component to most of the identity positions that people adopt. There's a theatricality about public performance of identity that the maniac is like hyperbolically exposing, hyperbolically and histrionically exposing the performative nature of positions of identity, but particularly those that are based upon the positions of authority. Authority positions are nothing more than a performative sham. You always see this in teaching, where you suddenly have someone who's a teacher and then they suddenly become the boss. You think, well, you're the same person you were like a couple of years ago. How comes now you're this other thing that you're performing? Because you have to perform the role. You have to kind of fake it till you convince everyone that that's really who you are. The next question talks about the top of 6 and 7. Question 3. In the exchanges across the bottom of 6 and the top of 7, how does he foreshadow and use this foreshadowing to expose the stupidity of the police? Before we get on there, there's another transformation in the maniac here, where he starts talking about the law. Article 122 of the Penal Code states, whoever in his capacity as a public official imposes non-clinical instruments of restraint upon a psychologically disturbed person in a manner liable to provoke a crisis in the disturbance shall incur charges punishable by 5 to 15 years with forfeit of pension. So in the space of 3 pages, he's been a legal expert, a typing secretary, a linguistics professor, a professor of freehand drawing, decoration and design, and a psychiatrist in literally 3 pages in the play. They can't keep up with him because of his performative dexterity. Because he can perform the roles really well, they just can't keep up with the transformations in his character. And so the constable, terrified of losing his pension, is now worried about this. He's now worried about talking about losing his pension. And the maniac knows that that's what he's bothered about because he's heard him moan about it already. And so he performs another role that gets them off their guard. At the bottom, though, he says this. So a bit of a lawyer too, eh? Is this a clue to further undetected transgressions? Nothing in your curriculum vitae about a lawyer, not even a barrister here. And then the maniac says, who wants to be a barrister? I don't want to be passive. I don't want to defend. I'm like you, Inspector. I like to accuse, convict, judge, and pass sentence. Now, this is exactly the role that he ends up adopting in the play. He pretends to be a judge. And the pretending to be a judge is the thing that in the end tricks them into exposing their own guilt. So he's actually forewarning them about what he's going to do in his next performance. He adopts the mantle and the terrible props and the linguistic tics and all the features of a judge. And it's his performance as a judge that gets them to admit to their criminality. But he forewarns them of this, and they still fall for it. And so again, it's a way of exposing their own stupidity through this foreshadowing. And then he says, you've never actually impersonated a judge, have you, just for the record? Unfortunately, the opportunity hasn't arisen so far, but it's about to. This is exactly what is about to happen. And then he says, I'd love to do a judge. You see, the thing about judges is they never retire. So he starts talking here about how being a judge is appealing purely because you can be old and lazy and still have a nice sort of salary and a good position, even when you're useless. So he kind of exposes their laziness through his conversation. The fact that they like the sound of what he says here exposes their own sort of indolence, particularly of the constable who just keeps worrying about his pension. But then Bertozzo gets fed up of him, says, will you? And then the maniac suddenly responds, silence in the court! So he immediately is performing the role of a judge now. And they're all caught off guard and respond as if they're actually in court. Beg your pardon, my lord. And you can see here the automatic gullibility as the maniac adopts this role that he's already explained he has no experience of. So he's just told them, I'm not a judge. I don't know how to do it. I'd quite like to be one. And then the minute he says something that a judge would say, they all fall for his trick and start talking to him as if he's a judge. So all of these authority figures are of questionable validity. These roles are exposed through his meta-theatricality as theatrical performances. I'm just telling you that I couldn't be a judge. And then the minute he says something a judge would say, they all dance to the tune and go along with it. Oh, well, sorry, my lord. You know, they use the language you'd be expected to use when you address a judge. However, here, there's something a little bit more sinister going on in his lines. In this pose, he's posing as an authority figure in these lines. He's posing as a judge. But actually, in this particular moment, he reveals his lack of empathy as an authority figure. So he's pretending to be a judge and pretending that this is something a judge might say. Your lathe operator, touch of the shakes, couple of minor accidents, out to the grass. He's forced to retire. Coal miner, bit of silicosis, and he's fucked at 50. He keeps talking about typically manual labouring jobs. He's talking about the proletariat and how he has no sympathy with them because he's old and he's bourgeoisie and he's got his nice retirement and his salary. So in the pose of an authority figure, he exposes, again, the lack of empathy with people beneath them in the social hierarchy. They're all labouring jobs that he mentions here. A lathe operator. Lathe is a kind of tool. A coal miner. A housewife. We're not talking here about, judge, psychiatrist, important roles. We're talking here about the little people. And here, his own lack of empathy with them. This is where he becomes one of the police. He becomes part of the problem in these roles. Question 4. This says, on page 8, examine the lines from Constable, he's bananas, down to we can't afford another one. How do these lines expose the corruption and stupidity of the police? We look over the page, and we're looking at that little passage there. It says, he's bananas. The maniac is sniffing the floor like a dog, and they creep up on him. And they shout, go for him! They rush at the maniac, and then they hit each other. And the maniac escapes to the window and opens it and sits on the ledge. I'll throw myself out. How high are we? I will. Bugger him. I'll give him a hand. And then the constable says, this place has got a bad enough record as it is. We can't afford another one. So he sets a trap for them here, and that's the reason why there's loads of mouse traps that keep going off on the scene. They're symbolic embodiments of the verbal and performative traps that the maniac lays for them. Why, first of all, do you think he is sniffing the floor like a dog, and then they creep up on him? They don't show any confidence towards him until he does this. What does this expose about them? He's on his all fours, sniffing the floor like a dog, and that's when they decide to try and get him. Absolutely. A minute ago, he's pretended to be a court judge, and they're talking to him like he's my lord. Now, he's sniffing the floor like a dog, and that's when they feel like they need to pounce. So again, it's exposing the way that they feel much more comfortable predating, being predators towards the vulnerable. Here I am in a vulnerable position on all fours, sniffing the floor. I'm tempting you to go for me. And they do, because they're idiots. They rush at the maniac and hit each other. So the kind of slapstick stage directions here expose their desire to pounce on his vulnerability. They're so keen to get him that they miss and bang into each other. The maniac escapes to the window and opens it and sits on the ledge. There's something symbolic always about any movement towards the window. He follows their kind of predatory attempts to get him with this movement towards the window, which is always suggesting to us in the stagecraft, truth is about to be exposed. You're about to see something that's part of reality. Well, that they predate on the vulnerable. And then he says, I'll throw myself out the window. How high are we? I will. And then Patozzo gives it away. Bugger him. I'll give him a hand. Why is this important? What's this telling us about Patozzo? That he's willing to give him a hand to throw him out the window. In terms of the truth of the incident that this play is about.
That if he can do it now, that he could probably have done it before.
Exactly. If he can do it here, and he can be tempted into it by someone pretending to be a dog, He could definitely have done it previously. And then the constable, stupid as he is, basically articulates the subtext. We've got a bad enough record as it is, we can't afford another one. Well, he halfway admits to the act here. You know, he, at that moment in time, has been kind of forced into this sort of brutality. You know, we've got this sense here that this is nothing new, and that the maniac has managed to, through his dynamic stage presence, expose the reality of what has gone on previously in the police station. And so his dynamism, his physical dynamism and his verbal dynamism is all put in the service of exposing the limitations of the police. That's constantly what he's trying to showcase through what he does on stage. The limitations of the police. And actually their immorality. When he's down there, he says, when I'm down there all sludgy on the pavement and doing the death rattle, and be warned, I shall take a long time to die and I'll be rattling a lot. The journalists will be flocking around and I'll tell them, rattling away, that you pushed me. But also then suddenly says, please stop it, come down, we shan't harm you. The way that his demeanor changes towards the maniac in the scene shows us that that's his real concern. It's with publicity. He doesn't care whether he dies. He doesn't care whether the maniac finds himself in physical harm. What he's bothered about is the tainting of his record, the tainting of his authority position, the publicity that would result from another incident like this occurring in the place where he works. So the fact that he switches attitude from the top to the bottom, you suddenly find yourself looking at someone whose buttons have been pushed in exactly the right way. He's worried about his reputation much more than he is about anyone's safety. And then at the bottom he says, remember the codicil to Article 122, provocation and violence towards those of unsound mind, all of them say 6 to 9 years and loss of rank. He remembered. The only things that they are capable of remembering are the consequences to their reputation and to their status of being convicted of doing things wrong, particularly penalizing people that are mentally unsound. So he constantly here exposes their self-interest in that line. The fact that they all utter that line together like a bunch of drones, saying to us, look how selfish these guys are. This is what they can remember. None of this other stuff that I've been throwing at them. The key and the window make their first appearances here as symbols connected to truth in this exchange on pages 9 and 10. It says, how do these symbols reveal the willingness of the police to both mask the truth and then accept any convenient versions of it? The maniac comes off the window, and then the Bertozzo says, lock it. So locking the window closes the possibility of the truth symbolically. If you see the window as the thing through which truth symbolically is either communicated or discovered, Bertozzo wants it locked. Stop it, we don't want any more truth in here, thanks. He goes to shut the window, and the maniac makes a bolt for the door, and then he says, I'm throwing myself down the stairs. Lock that bloody door, bumpity-bumpity crack splat all over the banisters. Bertozzo then throws the constable the key, who locks the door. And then Bertozzo says, and then throw the key, and the maniac says, out of the window! Deliberately giving them that tempting line that you throw everything out the window, so you may as well throw the key out there as well. And then Bertozzo says, yes. He heads for the window and puts it in a drawer. Open the drawer, put the key in the drawer. The constable puts the key in the drawer and then lock the drawer. And then the maniac joins in with this. Put the key in your mouth and swallow it. Yes, and the constable goes to swallow the key. So if you look at this exchange here, first of all, he says, throw the key out of the window. So the first version of this is to dispense with the truth. Just throw it out the window and hope that no one notices it. Absolutely. The window's locked, so there's no way of him throwing it out the window because he needs it to open it. Then, put it in the drawer. Hide it. Conceal this thing that symbolizes opening truth. Open the drawer and put the key in the drawer. So, hide the truth somewhere. He puts the key in the drawer, and then he says, lock the truth. Conceal it. Keep it hidden. And then the maniac finally joins in with this. And then says, put the key in your mouth and swallow it. So, swallow all of the truth also. You see this instability in all of the different strategies that they're willing to carry out with the key are symbolically representing all of the strategies that they're willing to adopt to prevent the truth from coming out, prevent the truth from being exposed. And the fact that he actually goes to swallow this shows us that they're willing to swallow any truth. They're quite literally willing to digest and swallow anything as long as it gets them out of a jam politically. You know, it gets them out of a sense of exposure. So these stage props, like the maniac's costume, the key, the window, have this really symbolic function in the text. It's a good place to stop, actually. Bit harder than you thought, eh?